best-selling In Search of God at Harvard. Professor Goldman came to Columbia in 1993 after spending 20 years with the New York Times. At Columbia, Professor Goldman is the director of the Scripps Howard Program in Religion, Journalism, and the Spiritual Life. In addition to the New York Times, his articles have appeared in a variety of newspapers, and now on the internet, you can Google Professor Goldman and get a whole list of articles that he's written. The most recent one was just recently in the Jewish Week, where he wrote about what he's going to talk about tonight. So, Professor Goldman was born in Hartford, Connecticut, educated at Yeshiva University, Columbia, and Harvard. He's the author of 3 books. At Columbia, he teaches the popular Covering Religion seminar that in recent years has taken students to Israel, Jordan, Russia, Ukraine, India, and Ireland. I understand it's a very popular program. You can tell us about it. He's been a Fulbright professor in Israel, a Skirball Fellow at Oxford University in England, and a scholar in residence at Stern College for Women. And he serves on the boards of several organizations. And he's an amateur cellist, and he lives in New York with his wife and children. I'd like to introduce Professor Ari Goldman.
Thank you, Steve. Really, thank you all for coming tonight. It's very nice to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces from the Upper West Side. Some of you have roots on the Upper West Side, and I've got deep roots there too. And I understand there's a football game tonight, so really, kol hakavod for coming out to here and talk about the Jewish vote. That's my assignment. The agreed upon topic is to talk about Jews and the vote, but I will also include some contemporary issues, especially things that are going on in Israel. My main area of interest is Jews in the news. So we'll talk about Jews in the news. I don't know about you, but as a Jew, I felt ignored for a good part of the recent presidential election. I watched the Republican debates with a certain amount of detachment. The things these men and women were talking about didn't interest me a lot. My issues were not their issues. When they mentioned their love and support for Israel in the Republican primaries, Republican debates, and the whole primary season, I felt they were not talking to me. They were talking to their Christian base, which, as you know, loves right-wing Israeli politicians and politics. I slept through the Democratic and Republican conventions. They weren't terribly exciting. Wasn't a lot of new things there that I didn't know before going in, and my Jewish juices didn't get flowing until the first, actually through the first presidential debate, and the second between Obama and Romney. I was asleep for a good part of the last year when it came to politics. But then came the third presidential debate, the one on foreign policy, and the Israel love fest began. Israel was mentioned 31 times. Anybody remember that? Stephen Colbert had a great routine about it. I don't have audio, but I just want to remind you, I don't know if any of you stay up that late out here, but if you're Colbert fans or watch the reruns the next day, he made the point that there were 31 mentions of Israel in the debate. And if you go home and Google that and look at that clip, it's basically Israel, Israel, I'm a friend of Israel, I'm a better friend of Israel, we have to support Israel, 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 back and forth, to the point where Colbert pulled out a bottle of Manischewitz and said he was going to take a shot for every time they mentioned Israel. By the end of his half hour, he had guzzled. He was like guzzling the Manischewitz bomb. The candidates were falling over each other to show that they were Israel's best friend, and would defend it in times of crisis and even before crisis. Both Obama and Romney promised to deal strongly and directly with any nuclear threat from Iran and its evil intent to destroy the Jewish state. From then on, it was about mid-October, Jews were back in the news. So again, I felt that we were sort of peripheral to the election for a long time. It was kind of a bore, predictable. Then it got interesting. They started to talk about Israel and Manischewitz wine. And I would say, if we got back on the map as a subject of interest, it hasn't stopped yet. The Jews are still in the news. In the final weeks of the presidential race, both Democratic and Republican candidates courted the Jews, especially the ones in the swing states. The Jews of Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio suddenly became players. They were important. The election was going to be close, everyone was saying, and the Jews in the swing states, though small in number, could be the swingers. They could be the ones who made the difference. The Republican coalition put up signs and banners in South Florida in an effort to win Jewish voters and to woo them away from Obama. You've seen that one? Not enough? That's from South Florida. And of course, Sheldon Adelson did what he did, pumping $60 million into the presidential campaign and not winning one election, not winning one seat, not even being able to sway his fellow Jews. It was good to feel at the center of things again. Suddenly, the Jews were of interest. Suddenly, we were on the national agenda. Suddenly, we were back in the news. And so it went. And as you know, Obama got 51% of the popular vote to Romney's 47%. Many people saw some sort of symbolic justice in his 47 number that may have undone him in the end. And how did Obama fare with the Jews? Well, the most reliable exit polls show that Obama got 69% of the Jewish vote. You may have seen this. This was a CNN exit poll that showed Jews voted for Obama overwhelmingly, almost by 70%. And before Jews take too much credit for his re-election, we should point out that while 69% is high, Obama did better in 2008 when he got, anybody know? 78% of the vote, right. Obama slipped among Jews, but then he slipped among all white voters. He didn't have the same white vote and the same enthusiasm behind him, but Jews came out for him, and but not as much as they did in 2008. It's a little bit of history that we'll take a look at. How did Jews vote? So what I'd like to do with you tonight is provide some analysis of the Jewish vote, going back a few generations and right up to today. I am, as you heard, a professor of journalism rather than a political scientist. And I know there are some political scientists in the room, so I will defer to you on some matters, but I know the news. That's my area of specialty, and I'm forever concerned and keep track of Jews in the news. So I will use that frame for a lot of what I will say. I will also take us beyond the election to some recent events in the news, such as the Gaza crisis, the vote of the United Nations, and the American reaction to it. And it's a good thing that I prepared some thoughts about that, because when I came in, several people said, so are you going to talk about Gaza? Are you going to talk about the UN? I anticipated what was on your minds, even though this is about the Jewish vote. So as is obvious from this slide, Jews vote Democratic. increasingly so in the last 40 years. So we go back to 1972. Who was the Democratic nominee? George McGovern, right? The late, great George McGovern. What were his Jewish numbers? 64% of the Jewish vote went to McGovern. Now remember, no one else voted for McGovern. How many states did McGovern win? One. Which one?
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. And I believe he won the District of Columbia. Jews still voted for him overwhelmingly. And then we go on to, a low point. 45% of Jews voted for which Democratic candidate in 1980? Jimmy Carter, right? We bottomed out with Jimmy Carter. And then you can see it climbs back up again. Well, it takes a big leap in the Reagan years, in the Clinton, who else?
Who was the independent in 1980?
John Anderson. Yeah. Did he get any? Oh, yeah. Oh, he did pretty well. Yeah. That was I guess those were the Jews who couldn't vote for Jimmy Carter. The major point, so as we contemplate that slide, this does not have the 2012 results. So this takes us up to 2008, when you see 78% that Obama got. He went down to 69%, as I said earlier. The major point that I want to make about the election is that Jewish voters are value-driven voters. By that I mean that they vote their conscience as much as they vote their pocket. So here is an American Jewish Committee survey that asked Jewish voters what their three main issues were in the election. You will see that while the economy figures prominently, so does health care, Social Security, and U.S.-Israel relations. Jews are not one-issue voters. These were the combination of things that motivated them most to vote. And then that's on the graph on the bottom. The graph on the top shows which candidates they affiliated with, which candidates they felt could best address their preferences on those issues. And you see a definite move to Obama. The colors are reversed here, I guess, but Obama's in red, he should be in blue. The Jewish penchant for values in the elections led the sociologist Milton Himmelfarb to declare quite famously, and that was, Stephen mentioned the article that I wrote in the New York Jewish Week. It turns on this phrase by Milton Himmelfarb: Jews live like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. He said this a generation ago when Episcopalians were a symbol of wealth and power. And his point was, and Himmelfarb, if you'll remember, was not a liberal, he was a neoconservative. And this sort of irked him, bothered him, that Jews support liberal causes, sometimes against their own best interests. To put it another way, Jews are tikkun olam voters. In our small way, we want to repair the world. Now, in any analysis, gross overcharacterizations have to be made. So you'll excuse my sort of if I exaggerate a bit, but to make a point. So forgive me if I make my thesis a bit too black and white. There are gray areas, and I hope to account for some of them later on. But as a general statement, Jewish voters are value-driven. We saw this in the recent presidential vote, a vote that divided America. Jews, by and large, live in the blue states, and the blue states went for Obama, and it seems Jews were an important factor in the swing states. We're only 2% of the population, but we have impact. Who voted for Romney? Well, to begin with, people in the red states. Romney did much better than John McCain in 2008. He got 47% of the vote and 206 electoral votes. Who else? It seems that Orthodox Jews voted for Romney. Some of you may have seen this map last week in the New York Times that did a precinct-by-precinct breakdown of how Jews voted for president. There's my Himmelfarb quote, and here's the map. The New York Times did a precinct-by-precinct breakdown of how voters voted for president, and you could see, you've got the colors right, the red are Romney voters and the blue are Obama voters. The map is awash in blue except for a few precincts. And what are they? Trump Towers, that was the headline of the New York Times story, right? The Trump Tower, you can barely see that. It says Upper East Side. Anybody see a red dot there? Apparently there is one. Apparently there are two. One was Trump Tower, the other was
Williamsburg.
We'll get to Williamsburg and Manhattan. The other was the Waldorf Astoria. So billionaires voted for Romney. And where else? Now we go to Brooklyn and to Queens. Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, such as Kew Gardens Hills in Queens and Borough Park and Williamsburg in Brooklyn. You can see down there, south of Brooklyn, Borough Park. You can right, Ocean Parkway, the Sephardic communities. Again, in the column that I wrote in the Jewish Week, I riffed on Milton Himmelfarb, and I wrote, Orthodox Jews live like Puerto Ricans and vote like billionaires. That's my conclusion from this map. I hope I'm not offending any Puerto Ricans here, but while they are different than their more liberal brethren, while Orthodox Jews and their voting patterns, at least in the selection, are different from their more liberal brethren, some of the same guiding principles apply. Orthodox Jews, too, are value-driven voters. They are certainly not voting their pocketbooks when they support the Republican candidates. I say this because many Orthodox Jews are poor. They rely on entitlements in a number of ways, out of proportion with liberal Jews. They live in public housing, they go to public hospitals, they get food stamps. UJ Federation of New York did a population survey earlier this year that found 34% of Hasidic Jews are living below the poverty line. They need government support. They need the safety net that the Democrats fight for and advocate for. Yet, these Orthodox Jews who depend on government to such a degree voted for Romney. So why? I think there are two reasons. They have, well, because of conservative social values and because of Israel. The first is easy. Orthodox Jews, on their social values, they don't like gay marriage, they don't approve of government-funded contraception, they don't like abortion, they don't like liberal democratic values, so they vote Republican. So again, they too are voting against their economic interest. This, by the way, doesn't bode well for Christine Quinn, the president of the city council who's running for mayor of New York, at least among the Orthodox. I talked to some Orthodox leaders who said we could never support her, even though she's right on all the social issues. We could never support her because she's gay. And we have a hard time explaining that to our community, explaining that to our children, that this is a legitimate lifestyle. So they're going to vote against Christine Quinn, even though Quinn is their advocate in so many other ways. So the social value issue, I think, we can understand. The issue of Israel is more complicated. To put it mildly, Orthodox Jews, and again, I'm using a broad generalization here, but the Orthodox Jews that are up there in red in those communities are suspicious of Obama. We could see that they voted against him. I would almost say they voted against him more than they voted for Romney. I will out myself as an exception. I go to an Orthodox shul on the Upper West Side, which you'll notice is all blue. And the chatter is all around me, especially when I visit my relatives in Queens and Brooklyn. Obama is a secret Muslim. They still say that. He insulted Netanyahu. He will turn his back on Israel after the elections. That's what they all said. He's saying the right things in the third presidential debate, but this should come when, now when he doesn't have to be reelected, he's not going to support Israel. So it's important to note that all these Orthodox fears have not been played out, at least in the recent weeks. In the days after the election, as Israel set to retaliate against Hamas, and somehow I think we, living in America and being very engaged in the presidential race, living in the Northeast and being hit by Hurricane Sandy, we're not really focused on what was going on in Israel. How thousands of rockets were being lobbed by Hamas into Israel, in major Israeli cities. And while we were paying attention to that, to our own issues and our own needs, there was this crisis brewing. And as Israel and really the immediate days after the election prepared to retaliate and to move into Gaza, Obama vigorously stood by Israel, declaring that Israel has a right to defend itself, as any nation would do when under attack. In more recent days, Obama stood by Israel in voting against the upgrading of the Palestinian delegation at the United Nations to an observer state. So Obama, even though he won the election, he still is very supportive of Israel and its cause. I don't think Orthodox Jews are suddenly going to change their minds. Those red dots are not going to turn to blue. But as I suggest in my Jewish Week article, they need to get used to having him around for the next 4 years. Talk of a secret Muslim president is not productive. But I don't want to wander too far from the election, although we could do that in the Q&A. I do want to get back to the New York Times map. I can confidently declare that the Jews on the very blue Upper West Side and the very red Borough Park are all, in their own way, Tikkun Olam voters. They just have different ways to repair the world. I do think that Himmelfarb is right. I do think that Jews don't always vote their pocketbooks. They vote their conscience more. Just that, as I said, Jews on the Upper West Side and Jews in Borough Park have a different conscience. While Orthodox Jews likely will not support Christine Quinn, the liberal Jews most certainly will. They see her election as a kind of tikkun olam. Jews are engaged and passionate about politics. That is our legacy going back generations. It is true here in America and it is true in Israel. We are a very divided community in some ways, especially when it comes to political debates. A tradition that I think goes back to the Talmud, when no one agreed on everything, no one agreed on anything. The Talmud is filled with disputations, and one Jew saying black, the other Jew saying white, one Jew saying yes, the other one saying no. This is part of our tradition. In Israel, it's often over the issue of peace. In America, it's often over social issues. But our instincts to be active in politics, to express ourselves both in shul and in the ballot box, are deeply held. Some pundits, especially neoconservatives, are waiting for Jews to wake up and vote their economic interest first. This has happened in other ethnic and religious communities. It's the first generation could be Democratic, but in time, the switch is made to the Republican Party. Perhaps that will happen in a generation or two, or maybe not. Maybe our Tikkun Olam gene is stronger than our need to assimilate. In the meantime, we have 4 more years of Obama in Washington, and I couldn't get a map of how Highland Park voted, so I don't know if we're happy about that or not in this community, but for better or for worse, it is we, the Jews, who helped put him in the White House. Thank you. Yes?
I just reread an article by a person named Kenneth Ward, who tries to explain the liberalism of Jews, and has the Himmelfarb quotation, as everybody does. And he thinks Jews vote on the left in the United States, and they still did in this election, because the most important thing to Jews is the liberal, not with a capital L, but the liberal state of individual freedom in which Jews can participate fully and not banned because of religion and treated equally. And he says anytime there's a threat to that individual freedom, Jews will react against it. So that sounded plausible to me. And I would have thought that that would mean even stronger Jewish support for the Democrats with all the religiosity and the Christian religiosity in the Republican Party. Mormons, the evangelicals, all of them were trying to prove they were more Christian than the rest. But instead the movement, it wasn't great, but the movement of Jews was toward the Republicans. And that surprises me. Does that make sense to you, or my question makes sense?
I'm not familiar with the author you mentioned, but I don't see a move away from the Democratic vote. I think Jews are sticking with the Democrats. There was a slide in the numbers this time, but as I said before, I think that's there were fewer white voters in general. Obama was able to rally the Hispanics and rally blacks to his cause. His white vote went down, and the Jewish vote is part of that loss. There are also those who say that he didn't win 78% in 2008. He actually won 76%, so it's not as much of a loss. There are people who are saying that Jews are not really moving away from the party. As I said in my talk, I think that we are value-driven rather than economically driven when we vote, and that's the my prognosis is that the Republicans have a strategy to win back the Hispanic vote. I don't think they have a strategy to win back the Jewish vote. And whatever they tried this time didn't work, clearly. Yes?
I guess I'm more on the liberal side in the voting, but my more religious friends felt strongly that they had to vote for Romney. And I still don't understand it. I really do not. I mean, they couch it with support, a bit more support to Israel, and the Christians are great for Israel because they love Israel. But is that what it is? It seems to be with a passion, these religious, more religious than they probably, I guess, they were more passionate for Romney than I've ever seen them for any other Republican candidate.
And see, my feeling is that they were more against Obama than so strongly for Romney. I don't know that they made the argument for Romney. And the passion I heard was the negative about Obama and people who just don't trust Obama. And I think we really have to look very deeply into ourselves, because I think a lot of that is motivated by racism. And I'm not saying that to be a Romney voter is to take an anti-Obama stand in terms of his race. I just think that I think some people just don't trust Obama because he's black.
Nobody seemed to care that Romney was a Mormon, and the Mormons are baptizing dead Jews and all kinds of stuff like that. They never made a big deal about it.
That was a big, at the beginning of the Republican primaries, that was the big fear about Romney, and that was raised, and evangelicals were coming out saying that Mormons are not real Christians. That didn't stick. When evangelicals saw the alternative, they saw an Obama re-election, they then suddenly embraced not only Romney, but the Mormon Church. I saw one headline that said, "Romney loses, Mormon Church wins." This certainly was a very good year for the Mormon Church. Yes?
It's a pretty well-known fact that in 2000 and 2004, the Orthodox community also voted highly for Bush, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So why would that be? In other words, what did the Orthodox community have against Gore and Kerry, right? Was it Kerry?
Yes. It's the liberal agenda that they fear. So that to vote for a party that's going to support abortion, support gay marriage, even though those issues, well, certainly the gay marriage issue wasn't rolling the way it is now, and it was a couple of years into Obama's term before he took the position against for gay marriage. There has been, among the Orthodox, there is this suspicion of the Democratic agenda.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why we saw it in the last in the Bush elections. The Orthodox go the other way, but we certainly saw. To go back to my earlier slide, we certainly see the numbers. We have 80 and 78% of Jews overall voting for the Democratic candidate. So the Orthodox
it was high as a group. It was high as a group, but in the Orthodox community, even in those elections, was the same thing. And like you say, maybe it's because of the fear of the liberal agenda.
And you also have to say that Bush was good on Israel. And I think people trusted him on Israel. Yes?
I may be going into a hornet's nest, but let me ask a slightly different question. It's more about American Jews' attitude towards Israel. Because Israel makes moves, at least from a certain point of view, which certain liberals are very uncomfortable with. And so I'm wondering if you think there'll be, again, a kind of split in terms of Israel between the Orthodox who sort of, they'll support Israel no matter what, and liberal Jews who kind of become a little bit disappointed, and it creates a problem.
So I'm sorry, repeat the question.
In other words, do you see a split among American Jews vis-a-vis Israel between, let's say, a liberal element that becomes maybe disappointed, or they're troubled, versus the Orthodox who are more supporters of the right wing in Israel?
Mm-hmm.
And is there kind of a split coming, you think, or a greater split?
I think that already exists. Between, if you just look at the reactions to what's happened in Israel over the last few days, with the decision after the UN vote to settle this new area known as E1 by the New York Times, near Ma'ale Adumim. That area, I think for many Jews on the left that they're sort of holding their head in their hands, and this is maybe not so much, this is sort of like the J Street crowd, and J Street exists because there are liberal Jews who support Israel but are pro-peace, who believe that there needs to be a place for them to express themselves. I think the AIPAC crowd, which goes along with everything Israel says, is going to have to toe the line on E1 as well. But there is a split. Luckily, our community is big enough to handle that split. I don't think there's, I think the bottom line is that both those communities say that they support the state of Israel. Yes?
Yeah, I wonder if the statistics can be massaged or have been examined any further. For example, mostly poor people are more likely to vote Democrat than rich people are. And I wonder if the poor Hasidim are more likely to vote Democrat than the rich Hasidim. Mm-hmm. Or looking at it another way, I forget. I was going to say. Well, let me just answer that one.
Let me just deal with that. That's who you would think would be natural Obama supporters go overwhelmingly for Romney.
All right, but you said 34% of Hasidim are below the poverty line.
Right.
Are they the 34% who voted Democrat? Do you have any notion about that? Are there any statistics about that one way or the other?
34% are below the poverty line, but that doesn't mean the rest are affluent. The rest, many of them are struggling. Many of them are just above the poverty line. We're not talking about a community that has many wealthy people in it. So this is a community that is taking orders. I think often from the top to vote a certain way. Although I did see that the Satmar Rebbe, after the election, announced to his followers that we have to stop spreading Lashon Hara about Obama. We're going to have to live with him the next 4 years, and we should stop saying nasty things about him. This is the Satmar Rebbe and Curious Joel, one of the two in the big fight.
My other question has to do with occupation. You know, again, wealthier people are more likely to vote Republican, but in some occupations, wealthier people also more likely to vote Democrat than in other occupations. And I think Jews belong more to the occupations that are more likely to vote Democrat. I just wonder if you know if that's true or if that plays any role in the fact that Jews vote for Democratic presidents mostly.
So when you say occupation, immediately I think about the occupied territories.
No, I don't mean that. No.
You're talking about Jews by their profession and how they vote.
Yeah.
I don't think there's there's an analysis down to what Jews do and how they voted. What's clear is that the Jewish billionaires were Romney supporters, and I think they got a very big stake. So that I read the Daily News. I actually used to write a column for the New York Daily News. Daily News is the paper of the New York people. It's the people's voice. Its readers are all blue-collar workers. Yet the Daily News endorsed Romney. Why? Because of Mort Zuckerman, because the man who owns it is a billionaire. And I think he's a billionaire, but he's also very right-wing on Israel and believe that Romney is the best choice for Israel. Yes?
You had said we are not a one-issue bloc. However, if Tikkun Olam is our primary issue, we really are a one-issue group. There's something irrational about that. It's hard to repair the world if your business is failing, or if the economy is falling apart and you don't have a job.
Yeah.
So as a scientist, I hate to think that we're irrational.
This chart may help. We're not one-issue voters. We're not Tikkun Olam voters, strictly. We care about other issues. And but if you look at how the voters feel about those issues, you see they thought, even on things like on the economy, that Obama could do a better job. it's not a truism that if you support Romney, you're pro-business. There are people who thought that perhaps raising the tax base is good for the Jews. It is good for the country as a whole. So it's when I began, I said I have to beware of oversimplification. But, and I don't mean to oversimplify this by saying all rich Jews do this and all Orthodox Jews do that. But statistics don't show us the finer points of, of every trade and every person. It's sort of a broad look at the Jewish world. Jews are hard to survey because there's so few of us. So if you do a national survey, Jews show up in such few numbers, it's hard to make any generalizations about that. So these exit polls are the best we have, but they're imperfect. Yeah, Steve.
I'd like to pick up on what you just said. I don't know where we are exactly, but I've heard 1.5% at the most. The Muslims equal us. Well, in fact, there are more Muslims in the country today than Jews. And I'd like, recognizing that Israel is a bastion that the United States can't afford to lose as the rest of the Middle East melts down. We're lucky we have the Christian right who supports Israel. But what's the impact of our shrinking percentage on future voting? We obviously, in some areas like New York and maybe Florida, will still have an impact. The rest of the country, we're going to disappear.
Yeah, the estimates are Jews are about 2% of the population, about 6 million to 6.5 million Jews in America, and it's widely believed that there are more Muslims than there are Jews now. The difference is that many of the Muslims are not citizens, they don't vote, they're not organized the way we are, they don't have a century of American life that they've built in institutions, and members of Congress. I should have checked, but Jewish members of Congress, I believe 30, 35. There's one Muslim member of Congress. They have no infrastructure the way that we do in terms of our political power. In terms of the future, I think Jews have to worry. I think we are shrinking. We have lost our some of our population, and that does not bode well for the future. And I think that's why we have to support the organizations that help us exercise this power. Yeah, in the back.
Sure. I'd like to begin with a brief statement. I look Upper West Side, I vote Borough Park, and to vote overwhelmingly for one party that they won't take us for granted, and the other party may write us off.
What was the first part of your question? Was you just sort of characterized your... I
characterized myself. I said I may look Upper West Side, but I vote Borough Park.
Oh, okay, okay. So your question is, are we...
Our interest, is it really in our interest for one party to think they have us in their hip pocket, and for the other party to think we shouldn't be trying to get the votes, we should disregard our interests?
I think you're right that it is not in our interest. I think it's good to be in both parties and to have a presence in both parties and for both parties to court us. However, I think we saw that played out in this recent election. I think we did see, even though the numbers ultimately went to Obama, and 69% of Jews voted for Obama, there was no certainty that this was going to happen, and there were a lot of Jewish supporters of Romney. I'm not saying that we have to all get on one bandwagon. I think it's good. I said that we are a contentious people. We don't always agree. Yes, sir.
Since you volunteered to go astray on the main topic, what do you think the final outcome will be with our problems with Iran?
Wow. I did say I was a journalist and not a political scientist, but I'm also not a prophet. I think we've weathered a very tricky period with Iran, and I think a lot of us are holding our breath in the last few months that Israel would strike, and that we'd wake up one morning and find that the nuclear program in Iran was destroyed. Whether it was smart or not, Israel held back. I think the pressure of the United States contributed to that. I think both Romney and Obama did support continued sanctions and not going in and starting a war. Although I remember very, very well, I'm sure all of you do, Netanyahu holding up the bomb, the cartoon saying, you know, this is our point of no return. And we have to keep an eye on this. I do have faith that the Israelis are monitoring this, and they will know when that time comes. And when that time comes, they will not act alone. I think it would be foolhardy to act alone. So they have to build a coalition with the United States. I think they have to get support for their next move. Yes?
I wonder if you'd speculate that if we came back in 12, 16, 20 years, and there's a smaller Jewish population in the United States, there's a much less identified Jewish population. You look at trends of assimilation and distancing, and there's certainly a much less supportive of Israel if Israeli policy continues to be as separatist as it is. If all that happens, it seems to me that, ironically, what may happen is that the Jewish vote will be less distinctive in terms of its Democratic Party origin, but it'll also be less distinctive in having any unique moral basis, values basis. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. However, I think most of us in this room are able to think back 20 years ago or 30 years ago and hear some of the prognostications about what's going to happen to the Jewish community. The famous one was Time magazine. We all remember 1963, 1964, when they said the Jews won't be around in another generation. You know, there'll be no Jews. And of course, the Jews are still here, and Time magazine is barely alive. No, it wasn't, of course, it wasn't Time, it was Life. No, it was Life. I mixed up my story. It was Life magazine. Look magazine? Okay. It was a magazine.
Life has special issues.
Right. So, but the magazine is gone. We're still here. Remember, I think it was 1980 when Rabbi Yitz Greenberg said that by the year 2000 will be two separate communities unable to marry one with the other. That the Orthodox will be in one sphere and the rest of the world will be in another. That was 30 years ago, and I don't think that's come true. We're still one community, even though there are divisions. I remember when I was at Harvard Divinity School, in 1985, they said that there were going to be more Muslims than Jews in a few years, and it was going to be all over for the Jews. We'd be overrun by Muslims, and the country wasn't going to be the same and safe for Jews. That's not true either. Our institutions are here, our representatives are here, and the Jewish community is in some ways stronger than ever. So if I were to look ahead in 20 years, I really don't think it's going to be all that different. I think what's going to be different is perhaps our cell phones will be embedded in our heads, but and we probably won't drive cars anymore. We'll have Google cars, so take us wherever we want to go. But I do think the Jews are going to survive. I think we've been through worse. And America is not going to survive us. It's not going to destroy us. America is going to has been a place where we've flourished and will continue to flourish. I say that because I'm a father. I've got 3 children. I educated them Jewishly. Because I'm a member of the Jewish community. I contribute to the Jewish community. I feel I know that in some ways we exist on gloom and doom and bad prognostications, but I think that our best times are yet to come. Yes.
As long as we're analyzing elections, as far as the makeup of the electorate in general, that since 1980, I heard this statistic on one of the stations, since 1980, the percentage of white voters in the electorate has decreased by 20 percentage points, but yet in this election, Obama got only 39% of the white vote. So what it really means is that collectively, minority groups are becoming a very significant force in the electorate.
Well, yeah, clearly, whites are becoming a minority in this country, and this is what diversity is about, and diversity has wrought. And as I said before, I'm not a political scientist. I don't know all the numbers, but I still think a majority of whites clearly voted for Obama. I don't think he is the
No.
No.
39. No, only 39% of the white vote voted for Obama, but yet Obama won the election.
Oh, that's
And the reason for that is because in the electorate, the percentage of white voters, in other words, there's 2 things going on. The percentage of white voters has decreased in the electorate, but also the percentage of white voters who did not vote for Obama, but yet Obama won the election, which means that the minority groups carried him.
White voters.
Yes, but they're also a very small percentage of the population.
Right. Yes.
I have another question, a question on journalism. And I'm upset with some of the reports I hear from NPR on the radio, which focus on the poor Palestinians, but never seem to mention on the missile side what was happening in Israel. But as soon as Israel hits Gaza, the poor children and so on and so forth. And I've heard people talk about how the New York Times is biased that way too. What's your opinion on the quality of the reporting and the biases?
Okay. My evening is not complete without a question like that about the New York Times, so thank you. I worked for the New York Times for 20 years, and I think it's the best newspaper in America. I don't think it's infallible. I think it makes mistakes, and I think sometimes its coverage is skewed one way or the other on a day-to-day basis. I think you could look at a picture and say, boy, that really favors one side. But I think it takes pains over time to give a balanced picture. There were, if you followed the New York Times coverage of the Gaza fighting, there were pictures of the Muslim dead, pictures of the Jewish dead, like one stacked on top of the other. There was a Hasidic woman who was killed, actually a Lubavitch Shaliach from all places, Mumbai, who was killed. And the picture in the New York Times, and I don't remember which one was on top of which, at least in the printed paper, but it had the funeral services for both, almost equating the losses. You can argue that they're not equal, that one side started. You can argue a lot of things. You can also argue that more Palestinians died than Israelis died. I don't envy the New York Times correspondent in Israel. I think it's a very, very hard job. NPR, sometimes called National Palestinian Radio. I know that some people really don't like its coverage. I don't often like its coverage, but I think what we have to keep in mind is they're not advocates for one side, and they shouldn't be advocates. They should report the news. And these journalists, and I know many of them, are risking their lives to tell the story. And they're not perfect, but they're trying to show balance.
I was speaking with an Arab colleague one day about the New York Times, and I said, oh, they're anti-Israel. And he looked at me and said, we say they're anti-Arab.
It's seen as a Jewish newspaper, of course, by the Arab side.
I mean, just to follow up on the New York Times, we've subscribed for like 40 years, so we get it every day. And my opinion is that their news seems to be slanted to more hostile to Jews, Israel. But the editorials and the op-eds seem to be balanced. That's the way I see it. But the front pages always, maybe in the Gaza thing lately, maybe not as much. But up till now, they would always show some Israel atrocity immediately, and then later on they would say it was in reaction to rockets coming from the other side. But they didn't say that. Now they maybe, in the Gaza, they seem to be doing a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's a new correspondent, Jody Grudorn, who I think has done a very good job. And it's a very complex situation. If you look at the story on page 1 of today's New York Times about collaborators and how they're treated, it's one of the most horrific stories, and the photos inside of a collaborator being tortured is just as very disturbing. And you don't know whether that person was a collaborator, and sort of mob justice that prevails. From the New York Times point of view, it has to tell the story as best it can and illuminate the a situation that's impossible to tell fairly because everybody on each side is so passionate about it. So I don't think we're going to ever make people happy. But that's not the job of the press. The job of the press is to sort of challenge you, make you think. But I will add one last thing, and that was a survey that CNN did during the Gaza war, or this latest, thank God it didn't escalate to a full war, but into this Gaza incursion. It showed that 57% of Americans support Israel's right to retaliate. 57%. And about 13% favor the Palestinians. So this huge support for Israel among Americans and Israel's right and necessity to retaliate. So if the press is doing such a bad job of telling the Israel story, I wonder why there's so much support in America. Thank you very much.
We have time for one or two more.
Yeah, okay, sir.
I have a very different type of question, I think. This is the first time I can remember in memory where you had about 8 or 9 contestants for the Republican, all bashing each other, including Romney. What effect do you think that had compared to let's say, what I'll call a slightly different candidate had been finalized, one that maybe had more of a centrist, not so much anti-abortion or this and that. How would he have maybe potentially played against Obama?
I think that's a political scene where people are trying to tear you down. So Romney came in, I think, he spent 6 years trying to become president, spent the last year debating his rivals. They kept him on his toes. He was good. Even the Obama people knew that. But at the same time, they also tore him down. They also weakened him. They showed his weaknesses, and I think that did hurt him. However, that didn't continue. There was such an effort to rally around the Republican nominee that I don't think ultimately. I think on balance, Romney was strengthened by the primaries, not weak. Yes.
This is a political question, but what is your feeling about the proposed settlements in the West Bank, Jewish settlements in the West Bank that recently made the news?
As I said, I'm a journalist, not a political scientist, but it does disturb me. I think this is a time when we have to move slowly. I also think that we know how much Obama hates settlements and how he's been trying for 4 years to stop settlement activity. And I think right after Obama has shown such support for Israel, first in the Gaza, the build-up to the Gaza war, Obama said all the right things. AIPAC couldn't have written a better speech. I think the way he stood by Israel in the United Nations and voted against the Palestinians. Starting a major settlement is going to make the Americans unhappy. And I think it makes a lot of American Jews uncomfortable. I don't think this is the right time. And I also don't think, I think what this does in effect says that there cannot be a Palestinian state, a unified Palestinian state on the West Bank, because it divides it in half. So it's literally a divisive move. And I don't think it's well timed, but I'm sure Netanyahu has his reasons.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Goldman. I think we should thank Professor Goldman for an interesting. We'll stay around for a few more minutes. If you have some questions, you're welcome to come up. We have some more coffee and cookies left.